Welcome to Justice Is Now, the podcast. Justice Is Now is a charity with an aim of increasing the conviction rates regarding sexual violence. In each episode, we will be discussing various issues relating to this from many angles and discussing how education for criminal barristers could be changed. We will also be looking at understanding offending behaviour on a deeper level. And of course, we will continue to amplify the voices of survivors. Learn more about the work of Justice Is Now. All the details are below each episode, or you can surf there right now on www.justiceisnow.org. And it is only fair to give you a trigger warning. This podcast does contain graphic descriptions and frank discussion of sexual violence. Some listeners may find it disturbing or triggering, so please practice self-care. And if you don't think it's for you, then please don't listen. We receive no government funding for this important work, and so we're entirely reliant on donations. So if you can help us at all, please donate on the website www.justiceisnow.org. Thank you.
Hi Gemma, thank you so much for joining the Justice Is Now podcast. It's really great to have you with us. And I thought it'd be just great to start off just talking a little bit about your background, what you do in terms of, the ISVAs and in Nottingham, and just to give us a bit of background about your role.
Yeah, so it's really good to be here, by the way. So thank you for inviting me, because it's a really important subject. I started my career probably about 20 years ago now as a probation officer in Nottingham, and I worked within the prison environment. I then went to work with female offenders, and it soon became apparent that I would say a majority of female offenders were in prison due to some kind of sexual violence and trauma in their past, which led them to drugs, which led them to criminal behaviour. And so it was at that point that I thought I want to work with victims, predominantly females. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job with Nottinghamshire Sexual Violence Support Services, which was then Rape Crisis, and as an independent sexual violence advisor. And there was only two of us at the time. So, that was 7 years ago. So you can imagine that it was really, really difficult to liaise with courts and CPS and police, because although we were a recognised role, there was still no knowledge of sexual violence support, and that was nationally. So in Nottingham, we worked really hard to raise the profile of the ISVA service to be able to reach out to more survivors, and now we've got a team of 12 to 14, but we're still, we could still do with more, because demand is huge, unfortunately. So I now manage a brilliant team of independent sexual violence advisors who support survivors who have been victims, survivors of sexual violence, sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse. And that is predominantly people that are going through the criminal justice process, but we also support survivors that don't want to, can't for many reasons go through the criminal justice process. So myself and my team, it's end-to-end support. So when somebody first reports to the police or is thinking about reporting to the police, they get referred to us, and we basically go through that, I'm not going to say journey, go through that experience with them and support them throughout that whole experience.
Oh, that's amazing, Gemma. It's such a kind of broad experience to have seen it both from the probation side, and the offending side to actually the victim survivor side of it. Incredible. And I think it's so useful to have those links across the whole spectrum, really, to be able to see how things join up. But again, it's really interesting what you said about people who have been through sexual violence and then end up perpetrating in some way, particularly with the women that you worked with. And I think sometimes, I don't know if you've noticed this across just generally when you're having conversations with people, that they don't understand, how much damage sexual violence actually does to somebody throughout their whole life. And I try and sort of advocate and amplify the fact that sexual violence, we're talking about rape and being a victim of rape, is a life sentence.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if you've sort of come across this like desensitisation, I'd almost say, of what sexual violence actually is and what rape is. Just be really interesting to hear your sort of thoughts around that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think working with survivors of sexual violence, and whether that's childhood sexual violence or abuse or into adulthood, is I literally cannot explain the impact. I can't give it enough emphasis in relation to the impact that spreads throughout that survivor's life. So we're not just talking about mental and emotional concerns and issues and complex PTSD, and which can go on to personality disorders and a whole range of mental health disorders. But we're also talking about the knock-on effect to do with employment, finances, drug, alcohol misuse. You know, everything that survivor experiences in life can be touched by sexual violence and what they've experienced previously. And so I think as children that have experienced sexual violence, that's a whole nother subject. To go into adulthood is very, very difficult, to form healthy relationships, trust, to be able to have a job, their coping mechanisms. Everything is, for want of a better word, out of kilter, because the people that they thought that they needed to be protected by actually harmed them. So you can imagine growing up, that's going to knock everything you think you know about humanity, and you're going to have a completely different view and perspective of that. When adults experience sexual violence, you know, I've worked with survivors who have whatever you would call a normal life. So they're in a relationship, they have a job, they, you know, they're well educated. And then something like this happens, and everything can be destroyed. So, and we're talking, you know, sexual violence touches people from different geographics. It's not something that just affects areas of poverty or, you know, uneducated. It can literally touch anybody's life, and it can destroy lives. And it takes a long time for people to rebuild. Some never do, but, you know, some can, but some never do. But they have to learn to live with it, which is just, you can't imagine. You can't imagine.
Exactly. And I remember a psychologist describing it to me about what, you know, people go through. And he said, it's like you're suddenly introduced to violence, and that kind of shatters your illusion of safety and other people. And I think that's such a good way of describing it. Like your introduction, if you're a child, for example, to safety is, and sex, you know, sexual kind of experience is violent. So that is a complete distortion, you know, and it kind of goes back, like, you know, listening to you talk about it, you just really understand what people go through.
I think also just to mention that we talk about sexual violence, but sometimes sexual abuse is not physically violent. And so there can be that confusion of, well, there was no force, there was no physical force involved in this. But there was also no consent. So that's another, I mean, we could talk about this all day. I mean, that's another conversation around what sexual violence actually is and what it looks like, and how a lot of survivors, because there was no physical violence necessarily, there's a lot of coercion, there's a lot of manipulation, there was a lot of fear. Then there's the question mark of, was that rape? Was I sexually abused? Because I didn't fight back, because I didn't say no, because I didn't, and so we've got to stop thinking about it in society differently. Of course, there is sexual violence where somebody is, you know, physically restrained or however that may be, but sexual violence and abuse comes in many different forms.
Absolutely, and that's such an important point, because, you know, and there's so many sort of teenagers I've, you know, worked with in the past, and say they're in a situation and they just feel they can't get out of it, so they do something just to actually get through the situation,
for sure,
you know, and survive it. And it's like you're saying, it's forced mentally to do it because you know, you've got no other choice. And again, it's that desensitisation of, like you say, like understanding what rape actually is, and what it can mean. And I do remember at school, like, a lot of people would make jokes about rape, and I used to find that really difficult, because And even still now, you know, you hear adults make jokes about it. And you think, again, this desensitivity about how damaging that is to people who've gone through it or who know people who've gone through it. And I really do see that a lot. And I don't know as well, like, because, you know, access to pornography and kind of the graphic nature of pornography, you also see lots of rape pornography, which you can just, you know, people just access.
Yeah.
And again, it's this, what I see is this kind of disillusion, like you sort of mentioned, about what actually, you know, rape is. And not kind of seeing it. It's almost like abstract in people's minds. And
I
actually
think
what it
society's
is.
got this view. Sorry, I think society's got this view of females being these enticing, sexual enticing creatures, and men have got this sexual dominance that they have to have sex and they can't control them. Not all men. I mean, absolutely not. A majority of men, thank goodness, you know, don't fall into that category. But there is still sometimes that archaic view of men need to have sex and we're like temptresses. So it's actually not their fault. And this is, you know, I look at my godchildren who are 8 and 10, and honestly, some of the things that they come out with, it's almost entrenched. It certainly hasn't come from me or their mother. It's almost entrenched from a really young age that there is this power imbalance. And it, you know, how we can change that, I don't know. We need to, but how we can change it, I don't know.
I know, and honestly, I remember having a out there conversation with, you know, both young men and women when we were talking about rape, and we did this session around it and attitudes and false myths around the whole topic. And we looked at this particular situation, and I stopped it and I said, look, going back to the actual physical basics, who is in control of the penis? Who is actually in control of that? Who makes a decision to use it? Who makes a decision really to weaponize it? You do. You can't blame that on the person you're doing it to. You've made that decision. You have physical control over yourself. And the thing is, it's so patronizing, isn't it? To like, that's what we used to say to men who do control it and not use it in that way. Make this assumption that all men can't control it, because, you know, you go back to the analogy, if you're on a beach and women in bikinis, right? If it was the case that we were just temptresses and men can't control themselves, then, you know, that would be happening all the time. But they can control themselves, and most men do. So I think the more we kind of play up to this stereotypes and these assumption of, oh, it is the woman's fault, some way to blame, it just completely eradicates the whole choice that the male's made to actually do that. Or like you're saying, that manipulation and that control, you know, it just eradicates the fact that they've made those decisions. And that, honestly, I think that's a message just to, like, constantly, I feel like I have to keep pushing back. Whose responsibility was that in that situation? Absolutely. What were they getting out of that situation? You know, how is she getting anything out of that situation? To the point, I remember once talking to some young people about, we talked about a group rape. And this young girl, it's one of the most horrendous cases they had in London. She was being taken from place to place to place, you know, and some of the people involved were as young as 11, some of the perpetrators. And it was only eventually when what they called it at the time an elder, so an older guy, came into this flat and saw what was happening to her. He actually stopped them. But up until that point, they were taking this person from place to place. And it was like they completely dehumanized her, and treated her basically like a rag doll. And when we were talking about this situation, one of the young people said to me, "Well, why did she go back to that boy's house?" And I said to them, "Okay, she thought he was her friend, and does every interaction you ever have with somebody mean it's going to be sexual?" She went back to his place because she was friends. She was really young. She just thought they were going to hang out. You know, for her perspective, she probably thought the parents would be there, but she would never have thought, I'll go back to somebody's house and I'll get raped. Why would that even cross her mind? So we had to go through this whole like breakdown, and I had to break down their opinion that a young girl who'd been group attacked, it wasn't her fault. And I thought, why are you not saying to me straight away, what has happened to this girl? It's disgusting. If I saw this happen, I wouldn't get involved. I would stop it. I would take them off her. If I see someone being taken down the street crying their eyes out, you know, there's a group around her, I wouldn't think that was okay. But it was straight away, let's jump to the defence of those who were accused. And coincidentally, they did actually get a conviction, which is a rarity, which we'll go on to. But it's this attitude of straight away, jump to the defence.
Victim blaming.
And I find that it's absolutely astounding how that, you know, has continued. And, you know, sort of get on my soapbox here a little bit. But I remember like starting to look at this topic 20 years ago. So, you know, I'm like 40 next year. And I thought things would have moved on. I do think there has been some movement in some attitudes from younger people, I have to say, coming up. But I still hear the same attitudes, like going round and around and around. And, you know, and I think it's got to go back to that point of it's your responsibility, how you use, do you know what I mean? It is responsibility. And also perpetrators are manipulative. They're clever.
Very.
You know, they look for any way they can make the individual feel vulnerable, whether that's what we talked about mentally, psychologically, you know, thinking that in some way they could be economically disadvantaged, that they could, you know, take their children away from them. It could be absolutely anything, make them feel unsafe in their community. And it is just going back to people maybe understanding more about perpetrator behaviour.
And consent. I think, as well.
Yeah.
Because I think that there's perpetrators that will groom and manipulate, but there's also opportunists. And you know, they meet somebody out who's intoxicated, and they go back to his or her play. And for the purpose of this, talk about male, female, male rape on a female. And or it can be male and male, female, female, but for the purpose of this, so and they go back, and it's an opportunity. So what they don't do is think, or they don't understand consent. But for them, it's, well, she's back here. Yeah, she probably doesn't even know what day of the week it is. But it doesn't matter. She's not saying no, and I want to have sex. So, you know what? It's not rape. Actually, it's about the education of what rape actually is. And I do think that especially within young people, there is that opportunist rapes where they won't ever see it as being rape, but actually it is. So we need to educate young people in relation to consent. Because that's, you know, it seems really easy, doesn't it? Consent, Leonie. It seems like, you know, we know what consent is. Consent is allowing, giving permission for somebody to do something, take something, whatever. But it's so much more complex than that when it comes to sexual violence and sexual consent. And there's a lot of connotations around consent that young people and even, you know, whatever age group don't understand. They don't understand.
That's fascinating. Because in a way, kind of almost you could say that then you're sleepwalking if you don't understand consent properly. Some of those opportunists, you're saying, like, are sleepwalking into offending behaviour without maybe understanding what that even is.
Or caring. What that is. In that moment in time, they don't, you know, not really caring. So I think there's a lack of education, and there's a lack of responsibility, because the responsibility always seems to be on the victim survivor. And so that then when we go through criminal justice process, and I know we're going to get to that responsibility seems to be handed over then to that survivor. Why didn't you do this? Why did you do that? Why did, you know, and it's like, I don't know, like you were saying earlier, the responsibility is within the person that used his penis or whatever as a weapon.
Yeah.
End of.
Absolutely. And that's it. And I think, you know, one of the amazing things that ISVAs do, and we'll sort of explain that, is go through the criminal process with, you know, to say complainants, complainants as they go through the process. And it would just be sort of interesting to say a bit more about how they're set up, and maybe a little bit, if it's okay, just talk about how the court is separate to the police, and a bit about the structure, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so do you want me to discuss about literally, generally report to court and the process that a victim survivor might experience?
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Yeah, definitely. Don't worry, I'll edit bits out.
Yeah, so I mean, so when a survivor makes that decision to report, and I think it's really important to highlight that it's what's right for that survivor. So as ISVAs, we don't discuss whether that survivor should or shouldn't report. It is, we support whatever decision they make. We give the information and the guidance as to the process, but the decision has got to be with that survivor. That empowerment has got to be with that survivor. If a survivor does decide to report, they will then report through the normal channels or through a sexual assault referral centre. So the normal channels will be to call the police, and then they will, more often than not, if it's a recent rape, they will go to a sexual assault referral centre to have forensic medical examination. And just by the name forensic medical examination, you can imagine what that entails. It's intrusive, and that's for evidence building. And then after that, the process will begin, and the survivor will have a video recorded interview where they will be interviewed by the police about their account of what's happened. And this is very generally only, so I mean, it might differ in different areas, but this is a general view from Nottinghamshire. And after the video recorded interview, then the investigation begins. What the police should do is update a survivor every 28 days in relation to what's happening with the investigation. And an ISVA's referred in at the very start, should be referred in at the very start. And that ISVA then can liaise on behalf of the survivor with the police if the survivor's more comfortable with that, can attend meetings with the police, and basically can just guide the survivor through the criminal justice process and be there. So we do have really good links in with the police, but we are very independent. And then the investigation, and the reason why I'm smiling is because the investigations can take a ridiculous amount of time, to the point where you sometimes just shake your head because you think, is this for real? This person's gone through this and we're 6 to 8 months in and you're still no closer to making any charging decisions. You're still not updating the survivor, so that survivor now feels worthless, not important, not believed. This isn't on all cases, I've got to add. There are some real good examples, and we're lucky in Nottinghamshire of good policing. However, there are many examples of not so good policing. So the investigation can go on for a long, long time. And then the decision is sent, it's internal, so it's sent to a high-ranking police officer and inspector to make a decision on whether it should go to the CPS to be charged. Sometimes cases are no further actioned at police level because of insufficient evidence. But if they think that they're going to meet the evidential threshold, they will send it over to the CPS. The CPS will then take some time to look over it to see if it meets the evidential threshold for the probability of a conviction, and then a charging decision's made. If the CPS don't think that there's enough evidence, then they will no further action the case, and if there is, it will then go through the court process, which can take.
So how long could that take, Gemma? Sorry to say, how long could that take in terms of getting that no further action? Notification.
I mean, the no further action in relation to a police investigation, Leonie, can take up to a year, sometimes more. I've just been in court with a survivor, and it took from report to court 5 years.
5 years.
5 years. 5 whole years that survivor has had to live with that shadow of an investigation, mistakes being made, it going to CPS, it then going to court, it then being adjourned, it then going to court again. And that's 5 years of that person. So when we're talking about life sentences, and we're talking about the impact it has on a survivor, 5 years.
It's just, I just don't think people understand like this is even going on.
No.
5 years, and it's not just that. We talk about the cost of living crisis. I never hear people thinking about, well, how much time that individual had to take off work. If that individual's got children, how much time they've got to leave their children. How much time everything takes away from what you actually want to be doing.
Absolutely.
All because basically you're trying to stop this person from doing, you know, most people go for it because they want this person to not do it to somebody else, which is so selfless.
Yes.
And a lot of people do that. They're not even thinking about their own justice. They're doing it for other people. And to get treated like that, 5 years, I'm sorry, I just think it's absolute.
And this isn't an isolated case, Leonie. It's not isolated. So, I mean, at the moment, we're looking at cases that probably take at least 2 years. And then, because of the backlogs in court that's been heavily publicised, it will go to court, it will be adjourned. I mean, imagine that. Imagine being a survivor and you've got a court date. So, the anxiety around having to go to court and literally, and a survivor explained it to me as felt like being disemboweled. So imagine the anxiety of going to court. You're due in court on the Monday. You've watched your video recorded interview, perhaps the Wednesday or Thursday before. So bearing in mind, that would have been done probably 2 years at best before you get to court. So you've had 2 years of trying to come to terms with what's happened to you, then to have to sit and watch yourself just after you've been raped. So imagine how the impact that has on you when you're having to watch yourself of giving a video recorded interview. And then on the Friday, you're told at 5 o'clock in the evening, I'm so sorry, it's been adjourned off. So it's not going ahead on Monday. It's now in 6 months' time. And then, so you took time off work, you've had childcare, you've had work with your ISFA to try and keep yourself calm and look at like techniques as to how to manage your anxiety in court. You've then watched a video recorded interview, which you're going to have to watch again in 6 months' time so that you can remind yourself of what you said. And then you come to 6 months and it happens again. And we're talking adjournments 2 or 3, 4 times, 5 times one case has been adjourned. And they're not just adjourned for the next week, they're adjourned for next year. It is beyond brutal. And this person is still, you know, if this person is guilty of what they've done, and we're not saying, you know, some people are, we do know that some people aren't, but you know, you've got to ask yourself, why would someone put themselves through a process like this if it was a false allegation? Because it is brutal. But that person's still walking around free. And then once it gets to court, if we get a guilty conviction, that's a big if, then sentencing can take place another couple of months after that. So this is a convicted rapist that's still allowed freedom.
Yeah. And also if you've waited 5 years, and then so let's say you did get a conviction, that the sentencing they could get 2-3 years. Sometimes, you know, they come out. It's all just sending out the wrong message, isn't it? Like about, you know, basically you can rape with impunity, almost.
It's sending out very mixed messages, and this is what one of the things that I'm really frustrated in is because there is there is publicity now about survivors being able to come forward and the work that the CPS are doing, the work that the government's doing, and blah blah blah, and it's all good lip service, but actually, when survivors do, the process is still really broken. So for me, I'm kind of scratching my head thinking you're just re-traumatizing people. You know, you're wanting people to come forward, and they should, but yet the process is still really, really broken. And why would survivors do that?
Exactly. And this is still live. This is not, you know, this is not just like happened 6 months ago. This is happening now. People are getting, you know, cases adjourned and having to wait. And I always feel like I'm pushing that message. People say, well, you know, things have really improved. And I'm like, yes, but have you actually spoken to people on the ground? Have you actually found out how things are changing, because they don't have, the Crown Court is independent. So how are you supposed to actually know? Unless people are going in and kind of checking constantly, are things changing? Are things changing? Have we checked? How do you do that? And that to me has always been a bit of a loophole when you look at the justice system. How are you checking that? And I don't hear the answers to that.
No.
No. The independent rape review was the first step where they got voices, and those voices to me are just on paper, and I just feel like they're just left on paper. And I'm not saying people don't have the right. There are people who are really pushing it and who really do care, but I still come up against constantly this battle of actually kind of feeling like there's much care around it. I don't know. Insensitivity.
There isn't, Leanne, and I think, I've spoke to ministers and so have you, who say the right things, who seem to get it, but yet the rape review, okay, brilliant, but do we see any real change? Like you say, it's a paper exercise. So all that demonstrates to me is it's actually worse to me, because it's kind of, so you know what's happening. You've heard the voices of survivors and what they're going through. You're recognising it, but you're still not doing anything about it at a strategic sort of level, at a high level. You're still not doing anything about it. That's insulting. That's really insulting, because if you didn't know, okay, but you do. You know what's going on. And how can you think that it's fair?
Yeah. And maybe it's a level of denial, because I spoke to somebody who's, very influential. And, she just sort of said to me, well, it's never nice for victims, survivors, or say complainants in this case, to go through court. It's never a nice process. And I was just like, you're making lots of decisions about these individuals, but you're just saying it's never nice. And it was that sort of thing, again, of this separation between what is actually going on the ground and what people go through is really astounding. And I don't know whether it's, training or what I don't know, but it's quite shocking, really, that people who are supposed to be in charge of caring about victims of rape and getting convictions seem to have these attitudes, really, of not being sensitive enough. I think is really, really shocking.
I think also judges, I think judges need, and they are trained, that deal with RASO cases, rape and serious sexual offences cases. They are trained, but I still think they could do more. That is their court at the end of the day. So I still think that they could do more. I'm a strong believer, and I think the Ministry of Justice, and I think, it comes from the Ministry of Justice, aren't necessarily in agreement with this, but there does need to be some kind of awareness. I'm not saying coaching, I'm not saying training, but awareness to jurors in relation to sexual violence and the impact that can have on how a person presents in court.
Definitely.
Because there is little knowledge from, we work in this environment, so we're really aware of complex PTSD and how that can come across and how it differs from survivor to survivor. But with jurors, there's a lot of
maybe bias,
the lack of knowledge around PTSD, and actually survivors of sexual violence most often than not do suffer from complex PTSD. And there's also this unconscious bias about, if that was me, I'd have fought off, or if that was me, I wouldn't have gone into that house, or if that was me, I wouldn't have. There is this real lack of knowledge that until that is you, and even if it's, God forbid, was you would act very differently to somebody else in that situation. You can't make that judgment. You can't, but juries do, and that's no fault of their own, but they do. We get a lot of acquittals because juries need to be made aware of how sexual violence can impact someone. That's not coaching. That's not giving any kind of contamination into their decision. That's just a fact awareness training. Even if it's a DVD.
And also, they also do need to understand about perpetrator behaviour.
Yeah.
Because if you've got no knowledge of sexual violence, as we said, and how can you understand what a perpetrator would use? Because the whole purpose in court, as we see, because we've got this adversarial model. So just to sort of explain that to everybody, the Crown Court's independent, and you have obviously your defence and your prosecutor, and your prosecuting side is the Crown Prosecution Service. So they're bringing the case of the state, and then the defendant, and that's brought by an independent defence barrister who is paid separately. And we have this model in the UK. In Scotland, they're trying out as a small trial around a potential one judge trial because of concerns around the jury model. However, in England, we're very unlikely to see that. Now, the adversarial model has problems in itself, and actually different barristers I've spoken to and you've spoken to will acknowledge that completely. And we've got a barrister who will be speaking with us on the podcast to sort of explain that a little bit more, and about living as, defending in these cases and prosecuting. But it's very difficult if you're coming into court, because often the victim survivors feel they have to almost prove this person did this to them. So obviously the defence is going to be, they always say it's about credibility. So they want to break down that individual's credibility. That's how they're going to win a case. They also say, for example, they will say something in court and they will just let it hang in court for the jury to think about. My concern has always been with juries, how do we know they understand perpetrator behaviour? How do they know about victims, survivors, their behaviours, and how there's absolutely no test. So, and lots of different studies you've seen, let's say, for example, I don't want to make a wide judgment here, but let's just say, I'm a 70-year-old woman, right? And I've been married for 35 years. It's a long time since I was going out, living my life, whatever. And I come to court and I'm hearing this case and I've got no reference point for how things are, like, people are living their lives anymore. So I'm just basically thinking about, wouldn't I? If you base it on your own behaviour, it's going to be so different.
Yeah.
And also, it's just I just find it fascinating. We've got no benchmarks or no test that anybody has any knowledge of this topic. It's actually, I think it's actually quite frightening that we have a system, and people will argue with me back, and we'll see this on podcasts coming up, will argue with me so much. Well, how else should we do it? Independent peers should definitely be, making that choice if somebody's guilty or not. To me, it feels like a real risk factor. And are we in a safer society using this model or not? That's the question. And what does it mean by acquittals? Is acquittals, what does that even mean to acquit? What's that threshold got to be? Because we're not allowed, and the general public is not allowed to see jury deliberations.
No.
So we don't get any insight.
No.
So how are we supposed to have any solutions if we're not allowed insight?
And also, those professionals working within the criminal justice, they don't get to find out why a jury has come to the decision that they've come to, because if we did, then it might help us understand a little bit more about why some of these decisions are taken. And it's something that I've been speaking to our CPS about a lot, because I sit on rape scrutiny panels in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire. And so we sit and we look at cases that have been acquitted, and we look at why that might have happened, if there's something different that we could have done. And predominantly it is down to that was the jury's decision, and we'll never really know why the jury came to that decision, other than they didn't feel that they could convict on a probability, unreasonable doubt. So that, for us, that's not going to change. That's not going to have any influence. It's not going to change what the jury decide, but it would give us some kind of insight as to how these decisions are made, and then we can look at what it is that's missing in relation to you know, the conviction rates, and because predominantly there's something about predominantly, and I've sat in lots of courts with lots of different charges and offences, but there is something about RASO cases, rape and serious sexual abuse cases, that the jury just aren't understanding. They just aren't understanding. And I've sat on cases where, and I really believe this. I've sat on cases where you could not possibly think that a jury is going to acquit this individual. You could not possibly think it, and they're acquitted. And CPS, and we're scratching our heads. The police, CPS, we have no idea on what basis they acquitted that individual, because the evidence was so strong. So strong.
And this is it. And, you know, if you think about an adversarial model, they must, you know, if you're defending, you're going to start to see patterns, right? You're going to start to know tactics, because
for sure
the jury are constantly acquitting. So you know the tactics that are going to make them think, oh, I'm not sure. And this whole thing about, maybe it's even around beyond reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
How can you ever be sure beyond reasonable doubt? So if someone keeps saying to you, you've got to be sure beyond reasonable, well, how can you?
You can't.
It's almost like loaded like that. How are you supposed to? It's almost like, how are you supposed to win then?
Yeah, and I think, you know, and by sexual offences usually, if not always, happen between two people. You know, rapists don't tend to do these things where there's going to be witnesses. So it is usually always one person's word against the other. And yes, we have evidence and you know, this forensic evidence and whatever, that sex took place. But quite often in these cases, perpetrators don't deny that sex has taken place. It's about consent. Well, how can you be beyond reasonable doubt that consent wasn't part of that, what happened? You can't. So it is a really, really convoluted and complex offence. Rape really is, because it's very rarely someone saying, no, I didn't have sex with that person. Well, you did, because we've got the evidence to prove that you had sex with that person. That's hardly ever in question now.
No.
It's always, we did have sex, but I had consent.
I know, and it's interesting, because when I was talking to this defence barrister the other day when we did some training, and I said to him, I was telling him about a case, and I'll share it because I have permission to share it. Obviously, I won't mention any names, but we had an individual who, you know, had known this family friends for 25 years, and she was a financial advisor. So she went over to his office in his house, and he switched and attacked her. Now, after she left and she managed to get away, he texted her and said, I know I raped you. Please do not go to the police. Otherwise, I will commit suicide. So eventually this case, over the, like you're saying, 2 years, gets to court. And this individual had pleaded not guilty. So I said to this defence barrister, and, you know, he'll be on the show hopefully in a few weeks to talk about stuff like this a bit more. I said to him, do you think because the conviction rate is low, that people will just say, I'm not guilty at that police stage instead of admitting guilt, despite evidence like that, because they think, I'll chance it in court with a jury? And he did get a conviction, but there was still one jury member who didn't agree. And, you know, for this individual, she just couldn't stop thinking about that one jury member, because she just couldn't see, you know, why. The evidence was there, the guy admitted it, but I just think that's the worry, that people will just think, I'll chance it in court. The jury will never convict me. Conviction rate's low. Yes, I've got evidence, but we can, you know, put it another way. And that is a real concern. And I sort of think sometimes people are missing the point about that.
It is. And I think also we've got cases where someone will plead guilty right at the last minute. And that for me is because they think that the survivor probably won't go the full length of the process. So there's that hope that the survivor is going to pull out. And so this individual then puts the survivor through 2 years of waiting, investigations, going to preliminary court, and then pleads guilty. Now, to me, that should be an offence in itself because of the harm that you have caused that person, that continued harm, because you've harmed them in the first place. You've harmed them beyond words. And then you continue, and you're allowed to continue to do that by putting them through an investigation that takes a long time, putting them through the start of some court hearings, and then you decide to go guilty. Why are you not penalised for that also? Because that, to me, is further abuse. And we're a system that's allowing that abuser to continue that abuse. So,
And also, if it was, if you make a false allegation and it's, then you will be, you would get the opposite treatment, but they're effectively doing that in reverse.
Yeah.
In a way, because they know that they're guilty, but they're just leaving it right to the last minute to pull out.
Yeah.
So it's exactly the same thing as if you made a false allegation and then you waited right before you're about to go to court to say it's a false allegation. There's the same thing. So
it's the same thing. And even when people that are sort of, if we're talking sort of governmental level, and they're talking about finances and how much money. To me, I'm not interested in that, but just their kind of language in relation to finances and how much money these cases take to get to court, with all the people that are involved, the court time, blah, 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 how much money that individual has actually wasted of taxpayers' money then to go not guilty. So if they don't even want to look at it from a humanistic side, if they want to look at it from a business side, and if that's if the humanistic side isn't going to give them the incentive to make some changes, then look at it at the financial side. That is going to take a lot of money.
It is
absolutely no penalisation to that person whatsoever. So why wouldn't you? If you was charged with rape, why wouldn't you just, like you were saying, either try it and go to court and try your chances, or take it as far as you can and see if somebody, see if that survivor pulls out? Why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
This conversation with Gemma Malfesi continues in the next episode of the Justice Is Now podcast. If you've been affected by anything you've heard in today's episode, there is support for you. All the support lines are listed in detail in the show notes of each episode. Do feel free to reach out and access any support you need. Thank you once again for listening to the Justice Is Now podcast.